So I think we'll get started this evening. I'm Ava Raspini, and on behalf of the Department of Photography, I'd like to welcome you all to the Forum on Contemporary Photography. We are really thrilled this evening to welcome four artists that will lead the discussion. Michelle Abels, Liz Deschen, Mariah Robertson, and Chris Wiley. Thank you so much for being here. We look forward to your provocative and stimulating ideas. The topic for today is abstraction in photography, a large and rather rich topic, and something I think that in the past years we've been thinking about more and more. Photography recently, a lot of work in photography recently has been exploring the very materiality of the medium and manipulation, both analog and digital, as well as an emphasis on process. And here at MoMA, we have two exhibitions currently on view that touch on this in some way. New Photography 2012, you see an installation view up top there, and Michelle is included in that exhibition, as well as an installation from our collection, Shaping New Visions, and you see a shot on the right from that. And then, of course, recently, other new photography installations that have touched on this. And I show this slide only to emphasize that these strategies are not new in photography. From Anna Atkins to Talbot to Man Ray and Mahoney Naj to Bruce Conner and Sigmar Polka. But perhaps there's a new urgency or a rethinking of these strategies and ways of thinking about photography. And I thought I would quickly read a quote. This is from an article that Chris Wiley wrote in Frieze last year about this way of working in photography, and Michelle and Liz and Mariah were all in that article. And he says, ironically, the moment of greatest photographic plenitude has pushed photography to the point of exhaustion. It is in the face of this waning of photographic possibility that these artists are attempting to carve a way forward by rethinking photographic subjectivity. So I thought for this evening we would have an open discussion. The artists here today will be leading that discussion. We did provide 4 questions for the artists as a way to begin our discussion, and your sheets on your chairs have those questions. But hopefully we will stray in all kinds of different directions, but maybe it's a good way to start. And I have to say, all the artists today in their own practices deal with the very large issue of abstraction in many different and a diversity of strategies and methodologies. We'll have about 2 hours here in the room for discussion, and I do encourage all of you to jump in and participate in the discussion. We do have microphones around the room. You can just raise your hand if you want to jump in, and somebody hopefully will come forward with a microphone. So with that, I thought I'd give the mics over to our artists today to begin. And you can pick them up from the floor.
Oh yeah, since it was my quote that was read, apparently I get to start. I guess I will address the first question, just because it's right there on the list. And I think that, with the risk of doing a little bit of like semantic flip-flopping, I think that it's kind of, it's a difficult question to talk about abstraction in photography because photography itself is necessarily an abstraction of the world. In a very fundamental way, where you remove, of course, like a slice of space and time, and turn it into something which seems like the world, has the texture of the world, but is in fact very much other than the world. And this is the kind of the beguiling aspect of photography that allows it to perhaps tell more lies than it tells truths. And so in some ways, work like, for example, Liz's work, which deals with photography very literally, very much as light on paper, as a sort of, as the photographic support, is perhaps less abstract than, say, any sort of snapshot that one of us might take. This is maybe I'm making an argument that's a little bit too far afield for what we're talking about, but I think that in terms of the thing that I referred to in Freeze, and what we, I think, are responding to, or I mean, I can't really speak for all of us, but I will say myself and what I feel like is in the air, is that I feel like photography of the world has become somewhat exhausted and reached a type of endpoint where there are so many images we're constantly inundated with on Flickr, on Facebook, on vast like Google image search, these sorts of things. It's very, very difficult now to make an image that has affect, that says anything, and that, I mean, this is not to discount photojournalism in any way. This is obviously something that we need. But in terms of artistic practice, it's become much more difficult for photographs to speak. And the return now to the studio with artists like Michelle and many others who are not here tonight, to the best of my knowledge, and the emphasis on the material support of photography, I think, is something that is a response to that, and a response that is a kind of struggle against photography's muteness, and a way to reassert subjectivity. I tend to think of the darkroom or the studio has now become a kind of camera obscura in which we attempt to project our subjectivities, in photography. I, of course, don't take pictures in the studio, but I try to think of the landscape itself as a type of studio. So I think I've gone on for way too long. But yeah, anyone's free to respond to that hopefully articulate thing I just said.
I think the shift that is occurring is more about photography having a moment that other mediums have explored, which is its ability to actually talk about itself. And I think, as the curators pointed out, and people have always participated in this term called abstraction. But I would say the real shift right now is really looking at what the medium can do that's distinct while it overlaps and discusses its relationship to other media. And I'm reluctant to use the word abstraction in talking about my own practice. I'm much more interested in talking about it in more expansive terms, in terms of self-reflexivity of the medium. That's pretty much my...
I mean, would you say that in that regard, photography is going through a type of modernist moment? Well, I know it has, but like a re-investigation of a type of...
I don't think photography was ever allowed its moment to be entirely about itself. So I don't think it's reifying that moment. I think it's actually happening, as we sit here right now.
But do you think that this was something that didn't happen somehow during photographic modernism as we know it? I mean, I think there was a certain amount of self-reflexivity.
I don't think that was the discourse at large.
Okay. That's fair.
Well, Mariah and Michelle, I'm sort of curious to see how you might position your work in vis-a-vis these terms or these definitions that we're bandying about, and even I like this term that you were using, Liz, about sort of a self-reflexive impulse rather than speaking about just abstraction.
Oh, yeah, well, Chris, you said, wait, what did you say about materials? What was materials investigation?
Oh, I'm investigating the material support of the medium.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Is this okay? Without?
It's better,
Better with?
with
Okay. I mean, yeah, that resonates with me, that the things that I do are very about the materiality of all the photograph, like all the layers of it. But I think of it. I wondered if you're asking if you think it's having a modern moment, particularly, or modernist, or I know what you mean. It's abstract painting moment, right? Okay. But I was thinking about why now, or 3 years ago, I was giving a talk in the Bay Area, and it was right after Ava, that show that they 3 years ago, Photography Now show. And the guy giving the intro, he was like, talked about, he was introducing me at CCA for an undergrad class, and he was talking about like Carter Mull and Wally Beshti and all these people, and then as if I knew them, so I had to start the talk with, I've never met any of these people, I don't know them, we don't have a community of dialogue. We don't talk about, there's just no dialogue. So I was thinking, why would there feel like there was a movement of people working in materiality of photo? Well, I mean, it's the extinction period of darkroom processes and film technologies, and it's the advent of digital, which is much better at documentation. I mean, not better, but it's become the mode of documentation and dissemination of the role that photo had in relationship to painting before, or the other media. Like photography might have been its own art form, but it also was doing the work of documenting everyone else's too. And now, I don't want to make such a distinction between digital and film, because there's whatever, it's a lot, take a while. But I think that the burden of being the documentary workhorse that was lifted from the chemical processes, and they're like mushier, and you can do more weird things with them. And it's harder to like open up your digital camera and rewire it, like solder the bits differently. So it is difficult to have some leeway with the rules. And as I'm sure you all know here, there are a lot of, if nothing but rules in photo culture. Anyway, but you're asking if it's having a modernist moment. I would think that would probably, when I look back, when I step back, it seems obvious that there's a huge thing shifting technologically, and photos always had a relationship to technology. And you there?
And I think that interestingly, and maybe why this moment is happening, why it's happening now is, and when we talk and you talk about your work, you always talk about how what you do are moves to kind of break rules, and it is kind of interesting how in like I would say all other media except for photography, there have been like tons of path-breaking, rule-breaking moves that have been done since, at least the beginning or the beginning of the last century. But photography has sort of been sort of stayed in its adherence to, well, we take a photograph and then we mat it, and then perhaps we have a white frame or a black frame, perhaps. And so in that way, I think that there's a tremendous, I think that people have just found that there's tremendous opportunity now to tinker with those rules and kind of poke at them and see what happens when we do. And then also to expand, as you were saying, to expand the parameters of the medium so that it can touch up onto other and bleed into other media, like painting, like sculpture, film also, but that was something that sort of mostly happened in the 90s with people like Jeff Wall and Gregory Crutzen and others, P.L. DeCorsia and other cinematic photographers. But right now, I think we're trying to push at the sides of the box.
What are these rules?
What do you mean?
I'm not.
Wait, you didn't get the rule book?
Mad at me.
I'm sure What are they?
I get yelled at for there's dust in your frame. Like, you wouldn't there's lint on your painting. You send it back.
Okay.
Not even that. Like all kinds. Like you are not allowed to touch the film with your ungloved fingers. You wouldn't want to leave fingerprints. You don't want to put fingerprints on a glossy print. You don't want to. You want to have everything centered. And those people that they use the easel to get their white mat perfectly centered when they're in making a darkroom print. And then there's other. There's I learned in darkroom, so most of my rule-based references are like that. I mean, there's tons of no, like, here's your assignment for a high-key photo. Oh, nope, you have too many dark tones, send it back. You know, or like I asked a mounter to just leave the seam visible between two pieces of mat board because they didn't have big enough one, and he like turned bright red and couldn't handle it, like nervously laughing.
But so if we're talking about rules, are you kind of, Chris, equating that abstraction as being a way to try to break out of rules, or what are you proposing?
I'm not necessarily saying abstraction per se. I'm saying the sort of broader photographic experimentation that's going on among, I guess, like our peer group that does include abstraction, but also sort of moves over into. I mean, you do a lot of still life work and other sort of like seemingly more experimental practices. I don't know. I mean, does this not make sense or?
No, I'm just understanding the parameters.
Yeah, and then I think it's also, and then I think that one thing that hasn't been mentioned is there's also a response to not just the proliferation of images through digital media, but the technology of Photoshop and these kinds of things, which allow for a type of intervention in the photographic process that was never available before. I mean, in your digital collages, someone like Lucas Blaylock, who's showing at PS1 right now, who does a kind of painterly move, a sort of ham-fisted painterly move with Photoshop, and then your sort of engagement with painting with chemicals, I think is a sort of a response to that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know. That was trailing off into a.
I have a question for Liz regarding self-reflexivity and the photography being allowed that moment. Perhaps, when painting or conceptual art or institutional critique, by definition, have to be self-reflective. Mm-hmm. So by definition, they have to be at the same time cynical and critical. And it appears that not only photography is allowed that moment, but also a moment of sincerity. It doesn't have to be cynical. It can be sincere. Photography can to an extent be itself. And then in some of your work, I see a very strong anti-authoritarian impulse, not only against the image, because the image instrumentalizes, but against, when we have industrial materials in relationship to the body, the reference is minimalism, but your materials decay. And decay is a big part of the discourse of the work. That, to me, is the opposite of abstract. Nothing is being abstract. A material that decays is concrete. It's nothing but itself. And that's kind of been left out of the discourse around your work. So the general question will be, what's the function of that decay, of how does decay of the material work, the stain, which I don't see either as the accident, as Polke playing the chemist with the accident. I see it as very ideologically directed, but maybe that's my own reading.
I don't view it as decay. I view it as something that shifts, and everything changes and everything shifts. And in my work, it's just maybe readily more apparent than other people's work. But I wouldn't use the terminology decay. What I leave in my kitchen decays.
Well, in the sense that the material or photography is meant to fix a moment in time, right? And the process
by
is
some
open
people's
there.
definition.
Yes. Well, the classic definition. All right, decay may be a little harsh, but it's an open process. It's never fixed.
But that's not my terminology for the work. That's your terminology for the work.
Yeah, most certainly. I'm asking you for yours.
And I think I gave it earlier. And I actually, it's interesting that you bring up the term concrete, because often when people talk about self-reflexive practices in photography, they do use the term concrete, which I think has a section to it that actually involves self-reflexive practices. Gottfried Jaeger, who's dedicated his entire career as a German academic photographer, has written countless essays on the practice of concrete photography, and he breaks it into 3 different groups, and the third group would be the one that I would consider myself to be a practitioner within, which would certainly be the self-reflexive moment when photography literally looks at itself.
So concrete, not abstract. At least
That's the way my work has been historicized through one historian. So I just think it's interesting that you bring up the term. I use neither term.
But Walid Beshti is using the concrete, by the way. Just Walid Beshti is using the concrete, and he also refuses to use the word abstraction. But it's very interesting because we chose the topic of abstraction, but I wonder, and that's a provocation, okay? Because in a way, I think that there is such an erosions of boundaries, and in fact, Liz, in one of your interviews, you are talking about your works being abstract and also representational, figuratively representational. And there is this sort of an erosion between styles and genres and mediums. And and we are talking now about, obviously, this photographic medium sort of exploding outside of the frame also. So we are talking about sculpture all of a sudden, or architecture, or space. And of course, we just were looking before at Moholy-Nagy, who was talking about his work as a space modulator. It wasn't necessarily photography. I mean, some of them were photograms and some of them were kinetic sculptures, but really he was referring to them as a space modulator. But what I think that it's also interesting when we talk about abstraction in photography is about this notion of how artists are extremely conceptually mobile these days, like how, in fact, a photograph today is mostly an image draft very often, that you do something with it and you do something else with it, and not only, well, Polke is another example. We are talking about Polke, and Polke would say that a negative is never finished. But I think that now we are not only talking about what Polke was doing in terms of creating this sort of an encyclopedia of errors, basically exactly the opposite of like, leave the dust, burn the negative, use the wrong chemicals, whatever. But also in terms of how images are being recontextualized and the notion of how they are abstracted in the process of being used in a different way than intended.
But isn't the point of a lot of this work that you have to be there to experience it, that it cannot be represented? That if I look at it in the magazine, it doesn't work?
Says who? What do you mean?
To actually experience some of these works, or her work, for instance. Liz's work, or some of a lot of this work, you have to actually physically experience with your own presence and your own body.
Is that where your question of authority comes in? The fact that the work won't document.
Right, that's important.
But that's true of many people's work, though. I mean, that's.
Yeah, but there are conventions developed for all that, and there are not clear conventions developed for this.
Okay.
There's not a new authority for this.
Well, I'd sort of like to pull back a little bit. I'm not really a photographer. I'm a painter. That increasingly the ground that I work on is photography, and one thing I'd like to say is, which I think is actually kind of important, is within painting, we do not have forums like this. I mean, they just don't exist, and I think there's kind of a reason for that. And Chris brought up that photography always involves some type of abstraction of the world. It's an extraction. It's a removal. Increasingly, there are more forms of removal and distance making, Photoshop, etc. Within painting, we don't have at this point all of this. All of this excitement that's going on. I mean, photography was not the same as it was 15 years ago. painting is pretty much the same. It is, it feels to me as a painter that there are no new technical issues, and since and I think rather interesting division, which it's been offered that Liz represents, that there is a type of concrete photography. That's, I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm just offering it. This has been proposed, but I think that was the real division between what abstract painting is. Is it's abstract painting where it's evolving from an image, or whether it is the thing itself which makes the statement. But I don't know, I mean, what is interesting for me is that photography actually does something that painting has given up on. And I like very much the way Chris speaks about being involved with the world. And what interests me as a painter with photography is that photography offers a perspective. Painting has sort of given up on the notion that there is observation other than within itself. There are models of social production, there are models of personal expression, there's language models, but this type of engagement, which is both abstract, concrete, and of the world, is increasingly a model that is available to photography and not so much to painting.
I don't know if you know that there was a symposium that Matt Witkowski and the Clark organized in Chicago last weekend called Photography as Model. And it was derived from Yves Lambois and the idea of painting as model and the idea of the porosity of photography, the many ways in which you can approach it as an idea for shaping art historical discourse in the 21st century. Not so much saying that photography is this unique thing that needs to be set aside and held up and studied as this almost specimen, but the multiplicity of it and the porosity of it, I think, is exactly what you're saying. You know.
No, I would say I'm absolutely fascinated by that, but there's one thing that I sort of bridle against, and that's sort of this notion of hybridity. I mean, I feel like photography has always had this physical component, the component of the print, a type of manipulation, a notion of perspective, viewpoint, a particular notion of time, which is distinct from painting.
Right.
And I mean, as a painter,
Did I use the word hybrid?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sorry. No, you didn't. That was, but the type of porosity I think is like a very good notion, the notion of hybridity where you actually lose the perspective that is available to photography would seem to me to be an enormous loss.
Just sort of picking up on some of these comments. It's 2012, and we're having a discussion about abstraction in photography in a medium that was invented in the mid-19th century. It's only a couple of years since the Tate actually bothered to appoint a curator of photography. There are still newspaper articles that you come across, or articles in various other parts of the press, asking, is photography art? I mean, to what extent do some of the speakers today or people in this room think that the reason we're having this conversation now, at the beginning of the 21st century, is because photography has been held back and not allowed, or kind of disallowed that conversation?
I think
or is that just too much of a huge question
that's
to
an
ask?
extremely broad question, Dan. I think that to a certain extent, as you said earlier, that photography has been denied that kind of conversation and that kind of moment to step back and look at itself and really pick itself apart. But one of the things that and I'm maybe diverting from your question right now, and if anybody else wants to field it in a more broad way, feel free. But I also wanted to add that one of the things that I've been thinking about as this discussion has been going on is that it's. I think that some of the response, at least on my part, and I feel like maybe others, and please let me know, is that practitioners now are focusing more and more on very specific and narrow parameters in terms of like what they are doing with their practice, I think. And I think that this narrowing comes as a response not just to digital image proliferation, but to some of the interesting advances in photographic practice that were made by people like Roe Etheridge and Wolfgang Tillmans earlier in the century, who had this kind of incredibly gregarious look at photography of like, we can take a picture of anything and somehow shift it all into one very diverse practice that now, at least I feel in my work, I'm trying to get sort of more of a handle on something, and this is where that subjectivity comes in. Because in some ways, Roe Etheridge's work and Tillman, well, Tillman's maybe less, for me is about an effacement of subjectivity. It's photographs as photographs as photographs. And I think maybe that sort of has led us all to look at the medium harder and also look at ourselves and how we practice it, at least for me.
You know, that might, it feels to me that what both of them are doing are related in a way, which I think is really interesting, bringing those two photographers together. But it seems to me to be primarily a discourse of photography as genre. So that you can use you can do this genre, you can do this genre, and in a way I think you're right, because it is something which is looking at the self-reflexivity of photography, in that these are photos that look out at the world but also look at its mode of capturing the world as typology.
I'd like to actually jump back to something that's been brought up obliquely a few times, which is the role of technology, and particularly the role of digital technology as a generator for new artistic practices and ideas. And I thought, since Michelle hasn't had a chance to speak yet, first of all, whether that is something that interests you at all, but I think it's something that the possibilities of Photoshop and what can be done on Photoshop has certainly changed how at least I think about photography today. But I know that recently you have started using Photoshop in a way, and your pictures have become much more complex visually and layered as a result, maybe more abstract in their look, although not completely abstract. And whether that role of technology has had any influence or impact in how you've been working and thinking about the medium in general.
Well, when I think I've mostly been thinking about the ways that we use and view images now because of technology. So, in one part, we've sort of been talking about space. I think space in the world and how it's translated in photographs, and I started to think about the way space becomes translated when we're viewing images on a computer screen. Partially, I think, because I was having to view my own images so much on computer screens. So I'm not. Yeah, I don't think I'm necessarily interested in the technicalities of the digital, or even it in relationship to more traditional uses, more traditional ways of working within the medium, but more in how it's affected our way of viewing images, and I think reusing them, and even the ways that these sort of new virtual spaces, like people can appropriate images in new ways and sort of, I wonder, almost make them more disposable. I don't know if that. So actually, and then just in relation to this conversation, I had been wondering, and maybe other people could talk about it, is if this sort of, maybe it's some sort of hybrid of appropriation and maybe some sort of abstraction, as if images are being taken from one intention and one context and then put into another. Could that be another way of photography becoming abstracted?
Yeah, I would say so, because I think that we started the conversation a little bit on abstraction as a formal medium, and obviously we are now thinking about abstraction as when you abstract something from its own intention, so a more conceptual aspect of abstraction. There is certainly a very strong social component of abstraction, which I'd love to actually touch upon now, because you were talking about how we look at things rather than what we see, a different way of looking at things. And so I wanted to go back to Liz and ask you more about the 360-degree field, because that's such an important piece. And also I want you to talk a little bit about that piece in relationship to Herbert Bayer's piece and about perception.
That's a big question. For people who don't know the piece, when Herbert Bayer was teaching at the Bauhaus, he did a drawing that never became an exhibition design, but the idea was that the viewer would be able to see work on the floor, on the ceiling, in front of them, behind them. So it was a 360-degree experience. In the drawing, the intention was that work would be put on top of these panels. I took the idea of the panel that would hold work and made the panel itself the work via the vehicle of the photogram. So I made very simple photograms that were silver-toned, that reflect the viewer in the space, so the space was as significant as the person who was viewing the space. There were a lot of changes that I made in the drawing that he executed. It was a rather confined space. I expanded it out, and as I said, I inserted photography. The architecture is really, really significant, which actually brings me, I hope you don't mind, Roxana, to a quote that I brought with me this evening. I'm working on another project right now for Secession in Vienna. I'm thinking a lot about that particular space. And I came up with a quote from El Lissitzky that he thought of in relationship to his own work in 1923 in regard to painting, back to painting, space. That which is not looked at through a keyhole, not through an open door. Space does not exist for the eye only. It is not a picture. One wants to live in it. So if I could describe my aspirations, they would be very much that, as Nick pointed out, that people actually have to experience not only themselves in the space, but the spaces change and the work changes and the viewer changes. So ideally, what Bayer has allowed me to do is to take these three things that shift, the viewer, the space, and the work, and position them in relationship to each other, realizing that the conditions are constantly shifting and changing. And hopefully that is readily apparent in the work, and if it's described as... Can be photographed. It can be photographed, which is why I didn't bring any photographs this evening.
So this is photography positioned at the confluence of phenomenology, because, not looking at the world, but being in the middle of the world, being part of it, and the social. Because the moment that we talk about perception and looking from different perspectives, it becomes a social component. And to that degree, I would go back to Bayer, to Lissitzky, and to Moholy. Because I think that their involvement, not just with photography, but the uses of photography in theater and stage design in their relation with, for instance, Bertolt Brecht and Erwin Piscator, with the Volkstheater, with ideas of the politics of perception and how you would activate perception from different perspectives, the way that they would use projection. All of that was part of what, I think your work, or this work, is also about.
And it's an aspect that also I kind of find fascinating, because traditionally in the photographic rulebook, the space that you are allowed in making a picture is the space sort of behind the picture, the space in the picture through the window onto the world that you are creating. And now I think, and also Mariah, I think your work does this, you can pull that out into space. And can you talk about that?
What? What? Wait, what?
I wanted to see if you, because you also,
Was
your work
listening?
also exists in space and changes the space in a very different way than Liz's does. But do you think about that as well, and how does that function in your practice?
About changing a space. I was really deep in a thought about the role of the role of like the mind and the perceiving mind in relationship to any of this stuff, and so I was a little bit in the like,
Sorry.
but I'm putting it into words for you. Because I was thinking with all these questions, I will get to it, but you said, but a lot of these questions make me realize, like, I could answer all of them in completely opposite ways. Like, all of these things, like photo is a lie, but also someone sent me a photo of my grandmother I never met yesterday in the mail, and it was like, whoa, this is a tiny piece of paper. Whoa, I'm having intense feelings. And that's what she looked like, or this little piece of paper. Okay, sorry. So, but I'm saying that, even in the first question about photos, abstraction, and but it is also a real indexical, something happened, like in case of a photogram. And I'm thinking, like, how can it be two completely opposite things at the same time? Well, it's because, like, we have, like, human perceptions and feelings, like, because it's not like, okay, sorry, it's a little bit stoner, but you caught me in the middle of a deep thought. Yeah, about I think mostly about the fragility of the materials. That's the other thing I was thinking about. Like, when you're talking about how it would change the space and like how a body is, or like how a person feels in relation to it, it's, I brought something. This is a little bit dorky, but I brought some photo paper because it's super fragile, and thought we could pass it around. Damn it. Two. The little one and the big one? Anyone? Okay, so you can go. It's fragile, but you can handle. These are like stuff. It's okay. Fingerprints all over it. It gets dinged or whatever. It's fine. It's a Kodak metallic paper, which is a little bit thicker. You'll see it's really like handled and messed up already, but and it'll get scratched as you touch it, which is the opposite of the permanence that photo is supposed to have. Like, it's supposed to be. I think my life is so much about, like, will these things last? How do they last? Under what light conditions? Do you have UV plexi on them? Is this like what kind of temperature room is it going to be in terms of prints? And then negatives is the same, keeping dust off them, keeping in a certain temperature. And digital files, like, how are you going to organize your files? Are they going to? JPEG is probably a solid way to keep things for a long period of time, but there's probably going to be a shift, like, from like 8-track to tape to CD. There's going to be a shift in like file, and it's going to be a nightmare of a hard drive full of file names that you can't read anymore. If your hard drive dies, you think that your digital files will last forever, but like just like one circuit goes in a hard drive and it's just gone forever. So it's the opposite. There's such a fragility in all, even in digital, and like black and white photos are supposed to last for 500 years in a cold storage. And then also is that not right? What? But also, you take pictures and send them all around the world from your phone, so they sort of like are very powerful, and you think that they're gonna, as long as people keep trading them and publishing them, republishing them, they're very strong. And, but I think you were asking a more sculptural, physical question, Chris, right?
Yeah, but that was a good answer.
Okay. But those opposites. It's both so delicate and can be destroyed, and it seems like it's supposed to last forever, and it feels that way. But it's so, like, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, it's so, like, delicate, moisture, it's a nightmare.
Actually, could I for both Liz and Mariah, as someone who cares for our collection, you all pose unique challenges to us. And it does, while it may be abstract in whatever sense you're talking about, you give us physical things that we care for. And I'm interested to hear both of you, speak about that, because we worry about the same thing with digital. You're right, like a little file gets corrupt, and then something that seems permanent is gone forever, or the hardware that it runs on is obsolete, and then we can't get it. Anyway, all of these issues of conservation and how they tie into abstraction, I think, is very interesting, because what you end up making and what we collect as an institution is so concrete. And so I was hoping you, Michelle, thank you, make our lives much easier. We appreciate it. But I was hoping that maybe Mariah and Liz, you could each speak about that for a minute, because, you give us very interesting headaches and challenges that we enjoy.
I'm glad there are institutions that enjoy. No, the challenges, because I think that's what the institution's actually about, is meeting the challenges of the artist. And I can't talk to the particulars about it, because I think it's too much about a particular body of work, because as Mariah pointed out, there's always contradictions. I've made some work that visibly changes. I've also made dye transfer prints. So within my practice, there's a lot of variability. It just so happens that the work I've made of late has probably challenged in ways that even conservationists aren't sure how to address, and I'm learning in the process. So I guess I'm happy to have another opportunity to think about the work in ways that I may not have thought about when I initially made it.
Oh, yeah, I'm a little self-conscious about that, actually. But it's the opposite of, like, you've all got a digital camera in your pocket, and that's a screen-based photography is also, like, photo can go in a lot of different places. I just thought that'd be the other kind, a meditative full range of. But it's about how you interact with that, so. Yeah. This is a very emotionally charged thing to think about late at night, about how things are going to survive. And I used to live with an oil painter. She didn't have any of these issues. I just worry about all of these things. So I don't know if I have anything good, constructive to say. This is, But you're definitely not, what?
But it's a a conservation rule that you kind of seem to break on purpose also. Right. Why, if you're worried, then why?
Well, this thing is just like, these are just.
Well, not though.
Yeah.
Not.
In general, why? That's a real hard tension, as I'm sure you all. Anyone who's studied a lot of photography, you have this little rule dispenser inside you that's like telling you what temperature to keep your stuff at, or. I'm sorry. Wait, what did you say again?
Well, those are traditional photographic rule book things of like, you need to make this archival and like everything must be pristine and beautiful. But you react against that.
Because how are you ever gonna come, make anything new, get past thinking that's already been done if you just do everything the way you're supposed to.
Totally. But then you create this a willful sort of fraught ness in yourself and in your practice, where you push these boundaries, but then you fear the consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
I think that's very sort of poignant.
Hi. Whoops. A couple times tonight I've heard photographs referred to as images. Does the museum collect images or do they collect pictures?
We collect photographs,
Well,
and
an image is
paintings, and
something on a
sculptures, and
screen.
drawings.
Something on a piece of paper is not an image. It's a painting or a drawing or a photograph. It's not an image. Images are on screens.
We have a few examples where we have collected digital media, but for the most part, the Department of Photography collects photographs. I think there was.
Yes, hi, my name is Ellen Carey, and I think there's been a lot of interesting questions brought up. But one of the things I think we need to do is contextualize photography and its history, and perhaps locate singular examples of abstraction. And I'm specifically thinking of William Henry Fox Talbot's Cascading Spruce Needles. There are some examples of Anna Atkins, as well as we go into Man Ray, Space Riding, and Moholy-Nagy. Since we are in the house of the great avant-garde of Jackson Pollock, and the avant-garde is an address, we have to remember that it moves around. Paris, after World War II, it came to New York City. And those of you who saw the Pollock show at MoMA by the late Kurt Von Odoe will understand the issue of size and scale, which was not available to our forebears in the 19th and 20th century. So if we can think of that as abstraction is a philosophy in art, and also a contradiction in terms vis-a-vis photography, which the excitement, much like we have with the iPhone, brings us into a universal language like music and color. It was so exciting to be able to have portraits, still lifes, the landscapes. Remember that Talbot could not draw, and I think most photographers can't, myself included. So that abstraction is simultaneously perhaps the process and image. I think we're fortunate to be in the 21st century, and this might be a posit comment to our guest tonight, that maybe perhaps the reason why it's being looked at is because the not only the technology of the photo image itself, and Polaroid, cyanotype, we can scale up. If we remember, Pollock took the canvas off the frame, stood in the canvas, the gestalt of the brush was itself the action, and then he furthered that action by pouring, action painting, drip painting, whatever, Morris Lewis staining, so that perhaps I think there might be a quick evolution from 150 plus years because we have access to materials that have meaning, the economy mean, size and scale, color, digital, which I have to boldly say I don't think it's photography, it's ink hitting ink paper. It's a different technology, like we have photography, film, video, etc. So I think that the shadow image is very exciting in photography. It's one of those great dualities, and but I think that's probably just extrapolated out from this abstraction as a philosophy of art, which is followed by minimalism and conceptual art. And yes, we have a lot of galleries in New York City. We only had 2 in 1970. And they did say when photography was invented that painting was dead. But I think you have a hard act to follow after the abstract expressionism, minimal and conceptual art from the late 20th century.
Not sure exactly.
Is there a type of abstraction which feels like it's inherent to photography, or is photography taking the imagery of abstraction from painting? Following up on Ellen's question.
I'm gonna.
Maybe I could get Brian to answer that because he's been very quiet.
I think we had a question back here.
James Hyde.
Just I think that we should answer first the question before we go to another question. Well, if we are to go a little bit further back again, I think that since we are talking about photography as a medium of light is the paradigmatic, aspect of how we could understand perhaps abstraction in photography. And obviously, Man Ray or Moholy were doing the photograms, which are primarily, that's how it's being produced, even without a camera, right? When in fact, in the 20s, Elisitsky, they both talk about painting with light, and basically about the person who will be the illiterate of the future will not be the person who doesn't know how to write, but rather the person who doesn't know how to take a photograph. All of these aspects are about, at that moment in time, about painting being indeed dead and photography being photography and film, since they do have a similar DNA, the medium of the future. And abstraction is very much a part of it, but, or rather the light is very much a part of abstraction, but I think it's very interesting even when Man Ray, for instance, is doing some of his great photograms. These intersections that we are talking about, he's being commissioned, right, by a company of electricity to do very commercial photographs about light, about electricity for their clients, and he comes up with these amazing photograms, which are primarily, yes, abstraction in photography to that degree.
I'm sorry, Roxana, I was just going to I'm sorry. I'm just over here.
I didn't realize where the
yeah, no,
coming
the
from.
speakers
Yes.
make it really confusing. I'm just going to build on what you were saying. There's a particular syntax that every medium comes to the table with, and photography is no different. So the syntax that photographs and photographers bring to bear have a definite direction. It comes out of the physicality. It was what Mariah was passing around. I mean, when we're manipulating the materials, it's very different from thinking about, oh, yeah, we don't have to mix any colors. I mean, there's no tubes. There's no pushing of squishy stuff. Painters are just messy people from what we can see. It's like we just have a whole different way of being. Not to say the photographers are all neat, of course, but that syntax comes out of a very real practice and leads in just different directions, a multitude of them, but very different directions.
I had a question, I guess. Two things that kind of hung in the air for me as you guys were talking earlier. One was the notion that the artist challenges the institution, and then this notion of erosion of boundaries. And I wonder, is this more an issue on the institution level, and these questions that we're bringing up, than for the artist, which we're talking about breaking down rules? And in a way, are you herding cats? Are you trying to get things to find a dominant strand or reasoning or trend where they generally aren't there?
It's our privilege to be herding cats. We define our curatorial departments according to media because we feel that that's the best way to care for the objects that we acquire. But artists don't necessarily think of themselves according to these media, and we don't even necessarily, decreasingly do we approach, a practice and say, well, that needs to be collected this way. But it's more, with Liz's work, we're talking very actively and working very closely with our colleagues in painting and sculpture, which is itself a hybrid, of course, even though it's treated as one department here. So, this is part of, artists make the work and we follow to interpret it and we follow to care for it, and the boundaries only make sense in terms of administrative things, but it's not a philosophical position.
Oh, I have then a further question. Roxana referred to Liz's statement about space and the viewer as a social space, and the idea of an artwork generating a social space is quintessentially abstract. An artwork is a model of a social space, so that is abstract. And it appears to be that the precondition to access that abstraction is something concrete, an experience, a phenomenological experience. So I will replace the charge decay, which had, or at least I think you felt, a pejorative connotation, the stuff that decays in your kitchen, but the conversation keeps on going back to conservation, conservation, conservation. So maybe the material is time itself. Maybe the quintessential material for that will be time itself. So the question will be how, if the question is photography now finally self-reflexive, what is it doing with time? Is the self-reflection quintessentially about time? Time seems to be the material to access the social.
I just saw that James Welling came into the room, so I think it's a good moment. Hello, James. To ask you a question, because we are talking about time and abstraction. And since you are late, we want to give you the word. I remember you once that you wrote that when you abstract something in an image, when you sort of denaturalize the image, when you defamiliarize it, when you make it strange, one of the reasons you do that is also to decelerate the viewer's experience in front of the work. Can you comment?
Yes, but that's not only a quality of abstraction, that's a strategy, I think a pictorial strategy. So I'm not sure it's necessarily tied to the idea of abstraction. Sorry I'm late. But the idea of, yes,
but
delaying a kind of understanding.
Right.
And I'm not sure that all abstract images do that. Some do. I guess you could say that was maybe a characteristic of the process of working with abstraction.
We are using the term now in more than just the former term. So a defamiliarization from the real, and in fact, going into the very real can also be a way of abstracting something because you are too much in the midst of it. So it's not necessarily that it has to be a non-representational image.
That sounds like a good question for Sarah Charlesworth.
I'm late too. I'm going to pass it on.
I don't remember now who was talking, but there was somebody who was talking about capital, basically. You know, who was? Well, of course, but no, in terms of abstraction, you know. So yeah, but anyway. And the abstraction of an abstraction.
I think for me the larger question is, if we're having a push now toward, let's not call it abstraction, let's just call it experimentation. We're having an experimental moment in photography. And these have happened before. It's not unique. We keep talking about the 20s and Moholy-Nagy. So the larger question for me is why do you have these changes in technologies, changes in materials, these facilitate or seem to suggest all these new practices, but why is everyone compelled to push the boundaries of the medium right now? Like, why do people want to make things three-dimensional and engage more spatial dimension, do things such as this? Is there a larger cultural idea of transformation that's happening right now? Is there a search for a larger vision of the future, perhaps?
Kevin, can I just say one thing, that medium means an in-between. That's what medium means. It's an in-between. It's a translational space. But I'm curious to hear what the others are saying about that.
I mean, I would say, Oh. I would say that the fundamental impulse, I think, behind the moment of experimentation that we're having now is a sort of broader waning of photographic affect, which you are shaking your head.
I don't buy that, really.
You don't buy that?
Photography's been held back, or now it's exhausted and it's having its sort of reinventive moment, because it's always sort of done that. I think there's a larger, more interesting cultural explanation for why there's a compulsion to experiment, to see things in different ways.
But what would you posit in that case?
The larger cultural, economic, social, technological transformations that create a search for a vision, just as Moholy-Nagy was looking for a vision of the future through experimentation in materials.
Sure. I mean, I would agree with that as well.
Isn't it more interesting to talk about it that way, perhaps, than to talk about it as something, as in abstract painting, something that's so sort of navel-gazing in its own activity?
Right. I guess the distinction that's being made, when I agree with your point and then also continue to hold my view of photographic exhaustion, is one is the sort of positive version of like, yes, we are going forth and we are trying to deal with this rapid expansion of the technological possibilities of the medium and our place in a rapidly evolving world as well, which I guess, yes, granted, that's correct, is probably...
There's a lot of nostalgia in sort of people using older techniques and things like that, but there's also a push to envision something more in the future, which is more, it's not romantic escapism, it's more like Ernst Bloch, Vorschein, of envisioning something to come, something, and I think that's a very compelling idea, as a sort of net, if we're herding cats, to throw sort of the cats into one bag, to sort of think of it as which would be really messy, but to think of it though as a kind of compulsion to sort of see the future.
Yeah, and I think there is definitely that impulse as well. But I think there's also a sort of a desire on the part of some artists to kind of get a handle on these things that are changing so quickly. I mean, I think about some of the artists who are using Photoshop in a very kind of bad way, in a way that like any child could do, etc. Is a response to the fact that Photoshop, not by design necessarily, because it's an open platform, but has been used as a technology of invisibility, essentially. One that fades into the background of the kind of numinous dream world of advertising and film and this sort of thing, and trying to, again, like pick it apart and be self-reflexive about this technology and sort of lay bare its artifice, but at the same time use that laying bare of the artifice to push perhaps the medium forward into a more futuristic progressive thing.
And to generate a conversation perhaps about sort of the ways in which we understand the world we're living in now and the way that's changing. I just always want to sort of bring it from sort of the focus of issues specific to photography, which to me always really represent, for me that's just a sort of like diorama of a larger set of questions about our lives at a particular moment in a particular place, and maybe it's too abstract to make the leap sometimes, specifically from certain practices in photography to larger issues in economics or social or geographic changes that are occurring. Maybe most artists don't think in specific terms that way, but I think there definitely is a kind of zeitgeist for trying to sort of figure out how things work through this sort of mechanism of photographic evolution.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's fundamentally because we live in an image-driven world now, and you can't really discuss photography without discussing the way that it functions to mediate our everyday life. And I mean, that's what I personally find so fascinating and sort of relevant and exciting about working in photography, is that direct interchange that it has with the world and with our place in it. But I'm also talking way too much, I think.
I find it stifling sometimes because I actually, people have referred to my work often as looking like stock photographs, and I never had, I was really offended at first and hadn't looked at that many stock photographs besides what's in our face all the time. And I mean, I hadn't done research in stock photography. And And then I actually started to look at them, and then I felt like everything was looking like a stock photograph. So I'm trying to think of what that had to do with what we were just talking about. Maybe just the fact of all these images. Oh, you
I
were
think
saying you
the
find it
waning of photographic
liberating.
affect. I mean, the fact that everything now kind of looks like a stock photograph because we've been exposed to so many images that it's very, very difficult to sort of differentiate one from another and to have one sort of poke through and really like actually get to you or say something maybe.
Well, I think actually for me, I just find it hard to photograph something.
Yeah.
Because it's like
there's already stock photographs of that thing that you might. Yeah. And I think that's what I was saying about the sort of like this feeling of having an endpoint, which I know all media have had this feeling pretty much constantly, but that feeling that everything is already a ready-made stock photograph is very difficult, and I think that's what we're pushing against. Or at least that's what I find I'm pushing against.
But I think Eileen Quinlan was talking about, like her work looking like suprematism and like, constructivism and also like stock photography and also like, product photography and commercial photography. And, when we were talking about raw Etheridge earlier, but one of the things and the way that he abstracts, one of the way he does it is basically appropriating himself, he does a thing that is for a commercial, for a magazine cover or whatever, and then he does something else with it in the context of, his own work within an exhibition space, Well,
I think that's why I started doing that also, because I was thinking about how people, again, like I was saying, can take whatever images are out there, or even take your own and use it for something else, whether it's just like their Facebook picture, and that it can become this other raw material that, if it's already going to have potential to be a stock image, then try to reconfigure it in another way.
I think what you were saying is very interesting, and but I don't think in terms of the future. I think about that we're just in the present doing what we're doing for all sorts of reasons. And this notion of exhaustion, in almost all forms that I can think of now, people worry about this. And when I teach writing, I'm a writer, and when I teach writing, students say, well, everything has already been written about. And so it's not particular to any one art form, and I think it's a false issue. I think that maybe came out of modernism, one of the problems of modernism, and one of the ways in which I think about how people perceive their present, and I think about how newness, to the extent that there is such a thing, comes in, is that the perception of any moment by different individuals is going to carry the culture, the differences that are being experienced technologically in all sorts of ways, and not necessarily as an articulated process or a bunch of ideas, but that through one's work, whatever it is, these will come into play in some ways. There are things that are being discussed now that weren't discussed 50 years ago because there are different things in the atmosphere, and I don't mean just our Earth's atmosphere. So I just, because I'm involved with words, I just wanted to say something else that may be entirely irrelevant. But the word amateur has disappeared. It has disappeared in photography. You never hear anybody talk about an amateur photographer anymore. And I think that maybe has its own pressure on photographers.
I, too, was very interested in what you had to say about the social and the political and the economic situation being productive of what's going on in photography now. I think it has not only to do with the future, I think it has to do with both the past and the future, which is that our recent past was so traumatic. The most recent trauma perhaps being the virtual global economic meltdown in 2008, that it didn't even look like there was going to be a future. And I think that that kind of cataclysm really frees up a lot of energy, you know, some of it creative, some of it destructive, but I think you're absolutely on the right track.
Well, and also to follow up, Carol, from what you were saying, I think something that hasn't been said is that this impulse, let's say, way of working or ways of working in photography more recently, I would say is more American than it is anything else. In traveling around the world, I think I see this kind of work more here in LA and, you know, throughout the States than I do certainly in Asia and maybe a little bit in Europe. And I wonder if anyone wants to talk a little bit about that or comment on that if they feel that that has something to do with what you were saying, Kevin, about this being a reaction to our specific moment, and really in the US is maybe what we're talking about.
Well, maybe in relation to that and the issue Lynn brought up to do with exhaustion, for whom, Chris, do you think photography's affect has actually waned? Because another way of looking at this sort of image culture that we live in is a huge amount of enthusiasm for it. People have phones in their cameras. There are people who are, enthusiastically posting things on Tumblrs and making like little videos for YouTube. I mean, who is the we that we're speaking of? Are we speaking about a specialist community? Or are we speaking about, are you talking in general about the, a kind of broader social body?
I would say that provisionally, I'm mostly talking about a specialist community. But I will say there is a sort of like a double side to the coin of the image enthusiasm that I think that we see, everywhere now because it's so convenient and everybody makes them and everybody likes looking at Facebook pictures and whatever. But at the same time, I do think that despite this enthusiasm, images have come to mean less and affect less, perhaps. This is my sort of working thing, but the way I was speaking about it in terms of a specialist perception, and I don't want in any way to get on a sort of like postmodern whining moment of like, oh, it's all so exhausted, and so the only thing that we can do is recycle the stuff that's already been done. I think that actually one of the most inspiring things, and one of the things that I think that is happening in the group of American photographers is this push towards subjectivity, this push against this feeling that that photography is exhausted, and against this lack of affect, and a reassertion of saying no. In fact, this is something that's very important to us, and very important to as a way of expressing ourselves, maybe, and that's incredibly not fashionable. But I think that in and of itself is a type of political act, which is why a lot of political art I find sort of to be redundant. But yeah, I don't in any way want to imply that I am thinking that we're in a moment of exhaustion that cannot be rectified.
Yeah, I have a comment that I hope will become a question, which is, I'm a curator, and a few years ago I was part of a curatorial team that bought a Polaroid by Barbara Kasten, and I remember distinctly the feeling of a slight bit of disappointment and remembering of Clement Greenberg saying the thing about photographic abstraction is that it's not real, because dimension is always like kind of part of the picture. And I remember when, at first, and I will say I've come to deeply love and profoundly respect this photograph, but at first I remember realizing how the picture was put together and the fact that dimension was still part of the image was a kind of a disappointing moment for me. And in the past couple of years, one of the things I've been excited about as I've walked around and seen images is that the question of dimension seems to have profoundly changed in the most recent generation of photography that's non-figural, which is to say, and I speak particularly about your work, Liz, that dimension doesn't seem to be as pressing a concern in the same way that it was a generation or two generations ago. What I find exciting about that is that it seems like there's some utopian impulse there, or some utopianism to that, partly because I read it in relation to someone like Milevich. And so that is a question, but it's also a kind of where I come to interest in this subject.
I'm not even sure how to. I think as a comment, I'm deeply appreciative of it, but I think it's impossible for an artist to really assess the particulars of their motivations when they're in it. You know, do I make work? Obviously, because I'm compelled to say certain things. Absolutely. Is that utopic? I don't know. You know, I'm not quite sure where to position that. You know, I hope that in viewing the work, that people manage to have experiences that they couldn't have had without having the work. So I guess that is a rather idealistic notion, that the work could actually bring about, you know, as Roxana said, you know, certain physical and perceptual experiences that otherwise wouldn't be transmitted. Thank you.
I would like, since Zoe Leonard is also here, and since she has a great show, and we are talking about photography and space, Zoe, would you talk a little bit about the camera obscura too?
Wow. I'm just kind of wishing that I'd been late. Well, I guess I feel a great affinity with a lot of the things that Liz is speaking about, and also something that you talked about with something, with the ability for a photographic experience to be both phenomenological and social. And I guess I've sort of been having a lot of thoughts about whether, you know, what constitutes photography. You know, is it an image? Is it a JPEG? Is it a, you know, does it only count if it's a TIFF? Like, is a JPEG too small? Is it only, does it exist before it's been printed? Is it the great picture that you really miss? Like, you don't have film in your camera, you lose it, you corrupt it, you delete it. Is that still like a photograph? Is it object? Is it an image? Somebody was sort of talking about the difference between an image and a picture. Or is it about a way of seeing? Like, is it actually a consideration of how we see and how we look? And I think that's, in my practice, kind of where I've arrived at this moment, and what I've been thinking about is how can something have affect and have critique, be phenomenological and social, be really beautiful and also highly kind of critical, and also be about time. So all those thoughts kind of led me to start making these camera obscura installations. And there was one other thing I was thinking about when someone was talking about this exhaustion, and just go see the Robert Adams show. Just the one even just at Matthew Mark's, like birds on a beach, light filtering through trees, and it's the vision is his eye is so patient and precise, and he's so fully present in those photographs that I almost couldn't believe it. Like, I left there with this huge smile on my face that someone could actually photograph those subjects and actually make me want to spend the whole day in there with them. So I I think we're, dealing with this massive sort of overflux of images, and we're at a moment, all of us as makers and thinkers and writers and curators and conservators, we're all sort of trying to grapple with what the medium can offer us and what we can offer it. But I also just think it's an incredibly interesting time to jump in the pool. Like, it's difficult, but like, there's so much great work to see, and that Adam show was just so, like, simple, but like, literally it made my week, so.
Joel. Can I just add to that comment? I'm reminded of the story of the Greek philosopher who was forced to take the hemlock. And just before he did, his sorrowful followers were at his knee, and he said to them, as my final gift to you, I leave you my greatest gift, the pattern of my life. And when I saw the Robert Adams show, I thought, here's the pattern of a man's life. And I think that may be, Wiley, a model, to look at the singular image, to look, is no longer relevant. Anyone with a little digital black object growing out of their stomach can make a reasonably good photograph these days. So the model of the photographer of a certain ilk in the future might be someone who, over a lifetime, addresses a subject, becomes quite expert, adds their own writing, their own personhood to it, and in the end, that differentiates a photographic artist from an amateur and offers at least one tenable model as the new photography wanes in its affect.
Inevitably wanes.
Yes.
I would agree, but at the same time, I do also think that some of the new photographic strategies, I mean, they could be seen as questions only of style, of these people have developed very unique, distinct personal styles, and in a sort of pejorative way. But I think that just as Robert Adams has developed a kind of vision over a lifetime, I would hope that some of us here are also beginning to develop just a different type, not a better type, but a different type of vision over a lifetime as well.
I wonder if it's as easy when you're, or it's never easy, but abstraction offers particular difficulty in that regard.
It does, but I mean, did you see the de Kooning show? I thought it was I thought it was a fantastic show, and when I went into the last room of his final paintings, as his sort of mind was degenerating, and they're not his best paintings, but they were so overwhelmingly beautiful, and you could tell that he was, despite the sort of degeneration of his mind, still holding on to this vision, to this thing that he had developed over a lifetime, which was, I think, beyond a sort of, maybe he's not commenting about the world or making a kind of specific sort of narrative commentary. But yes, he made hateful pictures of women, but let's pretend that part, we're going to discount that right now. I mean, yes, this is the common critique of that period of de Kooning, but and I also find that problematic. But I don't think that that's necessarily relevant to the discussion they are beautiful. That's necessarily relevant to the discussion. But that he was holding on to that spark of subjectivity, and I think that's what's most important.
Well, nicely said.
All right, well, we spoke about beauty, and I want to speak about poor images now and abstraction. Because that's also something, right, that is happening with abstraction, is the degeneration of the image, and maybe going back to, yeah. And I was just looking at some works at the fair last week of an artist by the name of Rabik Mroué, who took photographs with his cell phone camera during now the war that is happening right now, and in Syria, and basically taking pictures of the shooters, of the people shooting, and therefore photographing their own death, because they would be shot in the process of taking the picture randomly on the street. The pictures then being downloaded from their mobile cameras and blown up, and getting sort of very poor quality images. And here is a one aspect of abstraction where it is fully embedded into the real, and yet the image is dissoluted to a certain degree.
But I wonder why, like, are they being? It's obviously purposeful that he's printing them larger so that they fall apart more, and that obscures the image.
Either way, they would probably not have, I think it's a great piece by Hito Sterel, which I can't remember the name, but it's called, I think, Documentary Uncertainty.
Oh, she also has the In Defense of Poor Images.
Yeah, so she has a number of them, which are also related to the war. And it's about the same argument. That this has, for instance, she's talking about the first images that are coming from documentary photography, coming from a journalist during the war in Iraq, which are being transmitted at CNN. And that's like the onset of the war. And that's how we get to know what is happening there. And the images are beyond like recognition, taken with an apparatus that basically is not at the level of resolution that the reality of the moment would require. So I would like, since we don't have much time left, but to open a little bit this also other angle and sort of go into our fourth question and hear what you have to say. This is not necessarily related to your work, but I'm sure you have ideas about it. Or anyone in the room, by the way.
Yeah, maybe anyone else in the room.
Yes.
I'd like to throw out a question, and just so I guess sort of maybe even a little bit of a statement, but I think there's photography has become quite large these days, and with its largeness, I think it can be fruitfully asked, when is the photograph? And your description, I haven't seen these pictures, but it's like it's so poignant because the significant moment of the photograph is this pressing of the button, the shot, which is doubly meaningful. The capture, the death. And that is one particular moment of photography, but I think also, as Liz has very beautifully articulated, looking at a photograph is also a moment, how this thing exists within our architecture. So maybe with photography, I don't know, is there room for many different photographic moments?
Overarching idea is this kind of search for authenticity through the whole sort of swelling sea of images. What feels authentic to us now, and that the pictures Roxana are describing, the first transmissions, it's an aesthetic of authenticity now to see something degraded coming from the Middle East, transmitted through some secret way or something, is authentic, just as Liz's experiences with the photographs is a stretch, I think, for a sort of authentic experience of something through photography. I think we still want that very much. We're having to find new ways to try and feel that, depending on whether it's documentary or some other more kind of cerebral experience, perhaps.
Could I ask, those photos were they were at Frieze? Were they in like a fine art context?
I was at Frieze and FIAC within 2 days, and everything is a blur.
But
they
was
were at FIAC. They were in Paris.
Was it at a gallery? Like, how were they presented?
They were presented unframed, hanging on clips. Yeah.
But like for sale.
Sorry.
For sale.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
All photography is for sale. All photography is for sale.
Yeah, but
I'm
somebody's
sorry.
so uncomfortable
Wait,
with
you
that
don't
as
sell your
like
work?
a stop it.
Yeah, but that's what But that's
Yeah.
of course you are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what photography does, right? It's a witness to events, and then it's being sold, and then it's being shown in museums.
But also,
The question is one of artistic intentionality. In conversation with John Copeland, the late, great, fabulous John Copeland, he said to me once, Ellen, you have to photograph only in black and white. You can never photograph in color. And I said, John, and if those of you know John, you can imagine that English, brusque, commanding authority. And I said, well, John, okay. And he said, you know, you just can't. You can't do color at all, ever. And I said, but color is light. And he had a big laugh, and he said, okay, you can photograph in color. A lot of, I think, this artistic intentionality, you know, you had Edward Hopper when you had Jackson Pollock. I think in the context of Chris's question, post 9/11, I think there's a generation coming up that understands abstraction in literature, music, as Lynn Tillman was talking about, film, Paul Scherritz, you know, avant-garde literature, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre, whatever. And it's refreshing because I think in my generation it was a bit of a challenge because images needed to have a meaning. It's a different document than a tree or a portrait. So in the context of you're talking about these images, you know, poignant and bittersweet as they are, I guess I would have to ask, what is the person taking the picture? What is their intentionality? Is it the horror, the abstraction of eventually getting shot, perhaps? I don't know.
I mean, I wanted to maybe address your question because I also am familiar with Murray's work, and I think that you were bringing up that it was a sort of a question of style in the same way that like if you use like a handy cam to make a film, that it's like somehow exciting and documentary and more authentic. But you know, Murray is someone who reflects critically on these kinds of notions that we have, and I'm assuming that I'm not in any way presuming to speak for him, but I'm presuming that that is at the sort of heart of what it is that he's doing, is not only commenting on the war, but commenting on the way in which we are shown the war, the way in which we are, the way in which the war becomes authentic to us, when in fact it is actually abstract. I mean, except for the people who have been to Syria in the conflict, which I don't know if anybody here is, but. And in that regard, segueing into the last question, I think that aspect of photographic abstraction, as it is connected to the kind of surveillance state and the and media culture and this kind of thing, the question that you had was actually surprisingly optimistic. It was like this, and I looked it up, and it's this nice app that you can you can do that will erase like GPS stuff from the picture and will blur faces of protesters or blur people, you know, and so you can put it on a blog or on social media and you can be protected. But of course, the flip side of that is the global surveillance state, is the facial recognition technology, which is becoming more and more advanced every, you know, couple of years, perhaps every day, and which, using the idea of abstraction that we had in a sort of like more extrapolated metaphoric sense, I mean, this is a technology that abstracts everyone, that abstracts people's face data into a type of information that is then fed into larger databases in which people are simply, you know, numbers, and that to me is the frightening aspect of photography and abstraction, and the question to me was quite optimistic. But thank you for telling me about that technology. Hopefully, I won't have to use it.
Are there any other questions? All right. In that case, what we usually do is that we continue the conversation outside over a glass of wine. And before you all stand up, I want to mention that our next forum on contemporary photography will take place on January 29. And that we have invited actually a group of 4 artists who are also heads of photography departments. So we have invited Stephen Shore, who heads the Department of Photography at Bard College, and Jim Welling, who is here with us today, and he is the chair of photography at UCLA. We have also invited Ashley Hunt, who heads the Department of Photography and Media at CalArts, and who's that? And Gregory Crutzen, who I was blanking on the name because some of his students are here tonight with us, and in fact, it's a great group of people. But Gregory Crutzen has been appointed recently as the head of photography at Yale University, and I was very pleased to teach a course on critical perspectives. And raise your hands. Some of the students are here. It's a great class, but what would be really interesting to me is obviously to hear about also methodologies in schools today, and also about, you are all very young, but also about the next generation of artists working with the photographic medium. Thank you so much to the 4 of you and to everyone in the room.